Hello and welcome to Sector 3.0 conference. It's my pleasure and honor and a great opportunity to meet and talk with Julie Dirksen, author one of my favorite books that helped me become instructional designer. This is Polish title, but Projektowanie metod dydaktycznych in English, design for how people learn, if I remember correctly the title. Julie is an instructional designer, but also she's an expert in how we learn, especially how adults learn. And she'll be talking about how to strategize for getting a complex skill set, how to get a complex skill set, how to understand what a complex skill set is. And after her presentation, we will have an interview. So I'll try to be, for our audience, ask the best questions possible. Julie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So yes, I am very interested in how do we support complex skill development. The world is constantly changing and the easy tasks are going to be automated. We don't know exactly what the world is going to look like with artificial intelligence and some of those kinds of things, but I think it's safe to say that the things that are going to be most valuable are that complex or complicated skills and expertise in people. And so how do we create learning experiences that support people developing that kind of expertise and complex skills? So as we look at it, first of all, I want to be clear about how I define a skill. And the main question I ask when I'm thinking about something as a skill is it something where people need practice to be proficient? And if the answer is no, it's probably not a skill. It's a procedure, or it might be knowledge-based or something like that. But if it's a skill, people are going to need practice to be good at it. Also, skills tend to be things where people need to use judgment or have to be able to adapt to the circumstances. But the big one for me is, do people need practice to be proficient? And I have some skill, not a skill examples. So using that definition, I would say that something like saving a file in Microsoft Word is not a skill. That's a procedure, and you don't really need to practice that. You just need the instructions. And the important reason that it's useful to differentiate that is because you're going to plan for that differently. For saving a file in Microsoft Word, it might be enough to just have the basic instructions, or to have some kind of job aid or performance support to help people. But then we look at something like playing volleyball and we say, well, clearly that's a skill. Nobody's going to be good at volleyball unless they've practiced it. But then the third one, giving a performance review, that one gets a little more interesting, because most of the training I've seen about giving a performance review has been very procedural. First you do this, then you fill out this, then you rate this, those kinds of things. But when I ask this question of people, most people agree that to be good at giving a performance review, you do need to practice. And so it is a skill, which means that we should probably be thinking about how we train people to do performance reviews a little bit differently. How are they going to get practice? And one of the key elements for practice that develops expertise is that it needs a good feedback system. So I need to try to do the thing, and then I need to get good expert feedback on what happens. If we look at it, a few more of these, calming an irate customer, an unhappy customer, that's probably a skill. Filling out a timesheet, probably not, probably a procedure. Problem solving a missing supply order, that would definitely be a skill. And so the main issue there is, if the obvious implication for learning is if people need practice to be proficient, how do we think about designing and building practice for them as part of our learning experiences? And I think that instructional design overall has not focused enough on what good practice design looks like. We seem to know this and understand it for certain kinds of things. We know that you're going to have to practice to play golf. Nobody wants a doctor who hasn't practiced. Nobody wants a pilot who hasn't practiced. You don't even want teenagers driving who haven't practiced. But if I ask people what's more complex as a skill, driving or being a good manager, most people will tell me that they think being a good manager is ultimately a more complex skill than driving. Certainly we have more people who know how to drive than we have people who are good managers. But typically people get a lot more practice learning to drive than they do learning to be good managers. A lot of times people just get thrown in as managers and they practice on the job as they go. And I think we see the results of that in that there's a lot of management out there that's not what we would want it to be, not at the level that we would like to see it as. So if I think about it, I think where I live, you need 40 or 50 hours of practice with supervision to take your driver's test. If I could see that a manager, someone who's new to managing a team or a group of people, gets 40 to 50 hours of supervised practice at being a manager before they are given, quote unquote, their license to manage people, we'd probably have better managers. At least, that would be the goal. So complex skills could be any number of different things. I think providing substance abuse counseling would be a complex skill. I think project management, budgeting, like creating a good budget for a project is a complex skill. Coordinating a medical response to an emergency or an outbreak would be absolutely a complex skill. And so as we look at that, there's a model that I use that I think is quite helpful. And it's the Cynefin model. That's a Welsh word, so I'm not 100% sure I'm saying it correctly, but it's a model that was created by Dave Snowden. I first kind of got familiar with it when it was in the Harvard Business Review in 2008. And he was looking at this question of different kinds of problems or challenges in organizations. And if we start in the lower corner, he talked about how some challenges are clear. They're constrained. We know exactly what we need to do. We have best practices. Some challenges are complicated where there are constraints, but it's not, but it's not always clear exactly what the right answer is, and you learn it through expertise and things like that. And there's good practices for that, but not best practices necessarily. Complex is something where things are changing as you go, and so it's emergent practice. There isn't a best practice because we just don't have enough stable examples to know exactly what you're supposed to do in every circumstance. And then chaotic is situations where you are going to have to act before you have all the information, and you're going to have to come up with new ways to deal with things, or you're going to have to try to figure out how do you get enough control of the situation that you can move it into one of the other categories. So let's take a look at each of these and think about their context for learning. So as I said, clear problems, they have known solutions, they're well-defined problems. We have a clear relationship between cause and effect. We know if we do this, then this happens. We've got lots and lots and lots of history with these kinds of things. We know what the right thing is for people to do. So these are things where it's a procedure. We know in a software program to update a patient record, you do these steps. We know that to take blood pressure, you do these steps. We know that to set up, a vaccine clinic, that's something people have been doing a lot. Now it's pretty proceduralized. We know what the steps are for doing that. Anything that's compliance related is probably a clear problem. We need people to follow the steps as they're legally spelled out. These are straightforward tasks. So it might be, like I said, updating a medical record. It might be running a hotel breakfast service. It might be daily plant operations. Clear doesn't necessarily mean that it's, just a few things or something. Daily plant operations, there might be thousands of things that are part of daily plant operations, but we know what they all are. We know what good performance looks like. We know what the correct thing for people to be doing is. And we do sometimes want to practice those, even if they are procedures, because we're concerned with accuracy, or we're concerned with speed, or we're concerned with the integration into real world context. 10 Steps to Complex Learning really kind of breaks this down and is kind of the best text on how do we develop these kinds of skills where there's a lot to it and there's a lot of complicated pieces. Complicated problems, on the other hand, probably have solutions, but often require expertise to analyze or to identify, expertise or analysis to identify. I have been doing instructional design work for 25, 30 years, depending on when I start counting. And so when somebody brings a problem to me, um, I think about it very differently than I did when I was new to instructional design. And I can ask them questions and they can say, well, it's this, this, and this. And I can go, okay, I can put aside that whole set of things and I can focus here and I can ask some more questions. And I have essentially kind of a decision tree that is based on having seen many, 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 many projects that kind of helps me guide me through the process with somebody. And what they're usually hiring me for is the benefit of that expertise. I've seen lots and lots and lots of examples. I understand where we have problems. I understand where we're likely to have successes. I have a lot of background in these kinds of things, all of that kind of thing. And so complicated is something where expertise is really valuable, where people have these models, and it's gained through repeated and exposure and practice. And we can sort of identify a cause and effect, although you may need an expert to be able to do so. These are things where judgment is important, where there's some variability of context, but experience is really the crucial thing when it's a complicated problem. So playing chess is a complicated problem. You play a lot of chess to understand the patterns, and you can study principles and you can study theory, but really the way that people get better at chess is they play a lot of chess and they see a lot of examples and they start to understand, or they read about other people's examples and see a lot of cases. Medical research, for example, is complicated in the sense that people who are good at it are very good at it, but it does follow something of a predictable set of patterns, and people get better at it the more research projects that they participated in. A lot of business consulting falls into this category, where, again, having seen many, many, many examples, if you're a business consultant who's worked with dozens of startups, you can start to recognize what the familiar patterns are, what the common problems are, what the common solutions are, all of those kinds of things. So this is something where that expertise has been built up through repeated exposure. And you can move something from complicated into a clear domain if you're willing to do the work. So one of the places where this is the case is flight safety for commercial airlines. So if you were learning to be a pilot 100 years ago, you would go up with another pilot and they'd kind of tell you what to do, and you'd sort of watch what they do, and you'd kind of learn a lot by feel, right? Which is terrifying to think of, but probably how people learned to be pilots 100 years ago. But now we have said, well, that has an unacceptable level of error, because when planes crash, lots of people die, and we don't like that. And so we're going to do all of the heavy lifting to make sure that we've got clear procedures for every step of the process, and so that nobody is operating just completely based on their judgment. Now, obviously, judgment is important, and you want a pilot who has that expertise and things like that, but they've still done an enormous amount of work to make this clear and spelled out, because they're trying to remove error from the system. The next category is complex problems. And complex problems are situations where there isn't a right answer necessarily, because patterns emerge. So what are we going to do with the current situation with artificial intelligence is a complex problem right now. How can we use this is, something where we're experimenting and we're trying things and we're seeing what's working and what's not working, what's helpful and not helpful. And a lot of times we can only see this sort of cause and effect in retrospect, because we're dealing with changing and unstable circumstances. So what's the right answer is, it depends. And the real crucial thing here is your ability to go try something, gather data, and evaluate that data and make a judgment about what the next action should be. So this is something like innovation is a complex problem, unforeseen events, responding to volatility. These are all complex problems where you as an expert can't say this is the thing that's going to happen next, because it's too uncertain an environment. But you can say, this is how we're going to investigate it. This is how we're going to analyze what data we get back. And this is the process we're going to use to make decisions about what to do next. So design innovation is a complex problem. Product pricing. If you go to a product pricing expert and you say, I have this widget, how much should I charge for it? They're not going to say $6.99. They're going to say, here's how you do competitor analysis. Here's how you test product pricing in the marketplace. Here's how you set up and evaluate, audience analysis and all of these kinds of things. So what they're not going to do is give you a straight answer. What they are going to do is help guide you through the process of trying things out, gathering data, and bringing it back in. Because the cost that you can charge for a product may change tomorrow. If you've got a software product and tomorrow Google comes out with a free version of that same software product, your pricing strategy is going to have to change. There isn't a quote unquote right answer for it. A lot of leadership falls into this. What's the right answer? What's the best way for a leader to behave? Well, it depends. Is it day-to-day operations? Is it a crisis? Is it, turning around an organization that's struggling? Is it responding to big changes in the marketplace? The answer for what a leader needs to do is going to be very, very different in a lot of those different circumstances. And so really complex problems are about teaching people the skills to probe or put something out into the world, gather sense, gather data, and respond to it. And then the last one is chaotic problems, where cause and effect is unclear. We're going to triage and act to establish order, and we're going to try to pull things back into a more stable situation. So it could be a disaster, it could be a collapse, it could be an emergency. Things that are chaotic problems might be disaster response, where you're constantly trying to reestablish some sense of order, but you're also dealing with the fact that the situation is constantly changing. It could be a cyber attack, it could be a pandemic. And one of the big issues with a chaotic problem is you often have to act with incomplete information. You are often having to take action because you can't wait, but you don't have all of the information. And we saw that absolutely with the pandemic, where the large organizations were making recommendations, not necessarily knowing, for example, how COVID was transmitted, or how serious it was going to be, or some of those kinds of things. And they had to constantly evolve their approach and try to get control back over, so this stopped being a chaotic problem and could be at least be moved into the complex or the complicated domains. And this is, like I said, this is something where you're going to have to act before you can actually wait to gather all the information that you may necessarily need. So you're going to have to be able to adapt as you go. So for each of these, we have a different impact on learning. For each of these, we have a bit of a different problem that we're trying to solve. When we think about this from a learning point of view, I want to just spend a few minutes on that. Simple is, that's a sweet spot for things like online learning. It's well suited to e-learning or to self-study. It can be tested with recognition-based tasks. You can write multiple choice questions or scenario-based questions to test simple. Sorry, simple and clear are the same thing. I just realized I didn't get the update here. Dave Snowden keeps changing the name of that category. So simple and clear are essentially the same thing. But this is something where a computer can easily provide feedback because there's right and wrong answers. If we look at complicated, though, and we look at the implications for education, one of the things that defines complicated expertise is this exposure to multiple case examples. And so that becomes one of the big things we're considering when we're thinking about the design for these environments. You really want to test these with performance tasks, and the best feedback mechanism is somebody who has more expert knowledge evaluating the performance of the user. And so this is harder for a computer to judge. Now, exactly what will happen with the artificial intelligence in terms of being able to provide feedback in complicated scenarios, I don't know. It's interesting. We'll see. Other possibilities here include things like self-assessment or peer assessment. And then complex is something where what you're really learning is, how do I do this inquiry? How do I go out into the real world, gather up information, bring it back, make decisions on it, and iterate on that? And so that's essentially what you're training when you're creating learning experiences for complex, is what's the method of inquiry that we're going to use? how do I practice it with real world scenarios? It could be an online workshop or something like that, but it probably needs to be something where people are actively working through the process to learn how to do it. And then chaotic, the big implications for our purposes from a training or learning design is this might be, we need to give people enough exposure that they can manage their stress reactions in a chaotic environment. One of the ideas in a lot of training is the idea of stress inoculation. And the lower picture here is Sarita Robinson, who's done a lot of research into this stress and learning. And specifically, our research is focused around people trying to evacuate a helicopter if it crashes in the water, that kind of thing. So how do they build learning experiences where if this actually happens to you, your actual helicopter crashes in the water, you're not so overwhelmed by your stress reaction that you can't use the procedures you've learned to get yourself out and to keep yourself safe. And so that's a big part of what we're learning in chaotic is how do I manage my stress reactions in a way, in a volatile situation, that I can still operate effectively. And then also we're looking at procedures for triaging and bringing things back into order. So for these, it's not that any single topic is just in one of these categories. That's the wrong way to think about it. But the right way to think about it is to ask which of these are applicable to my particular learning challenge. And I may have some things I'm teaching someone that are clear. They're straightforward, they're simple, that's great. I may have some things that are complicated where I need to expose people to lots of case examples. I may have some things that are complex, and I may have some things that are chaotic. And so then I need to adapt my learning design to accommodate which of these things are part of my particular complex skill.
Thank you, Julie, for that. That was, for me, being both reader of your books and of the stuff you publish online, still amazing to hear. And I already have like few questions in mind that I want to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
But first, going back to your first slides and the play, is it a skill or not? I have to ask, this is one of the questions we are asking ourselves in the team in Sector 3.0. Prompting ChatGPT, is it a skill? Is it complex or complicated? Is it a clear or simple task skill? What do you think about the new skill we are all talking about, which is prompt engineering?
Yeah. I will say I'm not an expert in. I've played a little bit with the AI and the Chat GPTs. If I had to guess, and it is just a guess, I'd say prompt engineering is probably complicated in that there do seem to be patterns and formats that work better than others. And it's still early days. This is still emerging. But what I do see is the people who are getting the best results are learning some formats and some patterns and some structures. And they've been learning it through trial and error, where they've been trying a lot of things to see what gets the best results. So I would say that that's probably complicated. The bigger issue is evaluating the results that ChatGPT is giving you. And that is both complicated and complex, quite frankly. You need to have expertise to be able to read what it's telling you and understand, is this usable or not? It's in ChatGPT, the question is, it makes things up. It fabricates it. I was trying to search for some academic papers, and I thought, well, I'll see what happens when I didn't use ChatGPT. I used a different AI engine, and it was making up papers that didn't exist. And Philippa Hardman, who's out of the UK, has been doing a lot of work with AI, and she's found that if you tell it specifically not to make up papers that don't exist, she gets better results. Now, I wouldn't have thought that you needed to tell it that, but apparently you do. So if she puts a constraint on it saying, only give me results that are on Google Scholar, she gets much better results. Now, that's something she's learned through experimentation and experience with it. But you have to have the ability. Now, that one's pretty easy because I can take the paper and I can go plug it into Google Scholar and it tells me if it exists or not. But if I'm asking it ways to train, medical personnel in emergency circumstances, I can't just take those and plug them into Google Scholar. I have to actually be able to look at it and go, am I getting good advice back from ChatGPT? It sounds good. It sounds really confident and clear, but is it good? And the answer is maybe yes, maybe no. The the fact that ChatGPT and the other AI engines make things up is, I think, a feature, not a bug. And I think that that's important because we don't get rid of that. Like, that's not something where you'll just manage to make this perfectly accurate by the evolution of the AI. We have created something that creates new things, and so now we need to be able to judge whether or not it's useful, it's accurate, it's worth working with, and things like
Using,
that.
yeah.
So I think that's the
And
bigger
it's
and more
changing.
complex one, is evaluating.
Yeah, and it's changing very fast. So like we can expect new versions, new tools coming later this year. And I think with the metrics, with the idea how we can understand different levels of how complex the skills are, I was thinking a lot listening to you. If the technology we are using, especially in our work environment, is getting it's getting fast paced, very much lately. So the environment is changing, the technology is changing and updated even daily. And if the skills we need to understand and use it are complex or complicated, and you've mentioned that very important for gaining this such level of skills is the expertise we are getting from the exposure, from the experience, from the use of a specific set of activities in our life. So how can we approach this fast-paced environment and still try to build skills that they require some kind of expertise and experience? So how do you think about balancing this?
Yeah, and I think, exposure to case examples doesn't have to be that hard, right? It doesn't have to be that complicated. And I think that that's an underused strategy for this. So on that slide where I was saying skill, not a skill, that was exposure to case examples. We did 6 in a few minutes. And I find that the definition of a skill, something that requires practice to be proficient, is much more meaningful to people if they practice kind of thinking, yes, then I would categorize this as a skill and I would categorize this as not a skill, and things like that. Now, that's a pretty simple example because it's a pretty simple heuristic. But having people go through practicing putting stuff into skills or not skills categories I can do a lot of those quite quickly. And so engineering scenarios where people can get that exposure to a lot of case examples quickly, like I said, I think it's an underutilized area, but I think it's something that we can look at. So for example, I was working with a company that was a big manufacturing company, and they were talking about, I was doing an audit of their Six Sigma training. And one of the things that they talked about was having an important why statement, which is sort of your thesis statement for a Six Sigma project. And they were saying, well, it can fit the format. It can look like a solid why statement, but when you actually bring it over and start to make a project out of it, you find out there's a bunch of problems with it. And so I said, okay, well, what does it look like to have a good why statement? And they explained it to me, but it was still kind of conceptual, and I could tell that they knew, but it was a hard thing for them to explain to me as an outside person. And so that's an exact example where I would be like, all right, what I want then is I want a database with 30 different why statements that somebody can look at, form their own opinion about, and then hear what an expert has to say. And so then that doesn't have to, takes a while to collect the stuff, but it doesn't have to take that long to go through, because if you're just working in the environment and you're working on a team, you might see 4 or 5 why statements over the course of 6 months because it's the projects you're working on. But can I front load that with several case examples? Or can I see case examples of budgets that we've done in the company and which ones have gone well and which ones haven't gone well? So obviously documenting that is not a small thing, but if you collect it as you go, you can build up a really nice database of case examples that you can then go through. Like you can go through 30 budget examples, in a week or two, from a training point of view, where it would take you a few years as a project manager to go through that many examples in terms of just, working through them as in your own experience.
Like it's very easy to avoid measuring how we want to improve in organization, in the team. Like we can set goals, we can set some values behind what we want to learn and how we want to learn that. But like having this baseline, okay, we'll measure against this. Like we will measure the change in our practice with new software by a few data points, and we really will like learn from the results. Like we are not just waiting for the end result in a few years and then the implementation went not good enough, not well, which is like very often I think happening in many organizations, that they don't set up they set up the goals, but they don't set up the measurement for what they want to achieve, what they want to learn, how they want to develop. One more question. Maybe you have a comment on that.
Just one other thought on that is part of, especially in learning, there's this sort of overwhelming standard of we can do perfect measurement, and that feels overwhelming, and so then people don't do anything at all. And so I'm a big advocate for like finding small qualitative, rough and ready, like test something out for a week. Don't necessarily get the whole initiative, but just test it out for a week and then look back and adjust from that. Because I think we got overwhelmed by the complexity of measuring in a really comprehensive way, but that led to not measuring at all. So it's okay if it's imperfect, do something.
Yeah, just do something. Yeah, that's very true. That's a very good, I think, call to action for many NGOs who are struggling with that. Not only NGOs, I think. I hear the same problems from companies as well. At least one more question, maybe like fast-paced question for our last few minutes. So you've mentioned a few methods of how online learning can help with complex skills building. Like, do you have in your mind like specific tools and methods that people who are maybe shifting from stationary to remote learning and development or to remote education in their teams, in their organizations, how they can approach building complex skills in the team through online methods or online tools? What would help them?
Well, it's a big question. It's a lot easier to answer that in a specific case, but I'll try it nonetheless. There are some interesting tools that are facilitating review and feedback of things. So, for example, if you're training, customer service, responses and things like that, there are some tools where people can record themselves in a scenario-based thing, and then somebody can come and watch the recording and give them feedback on it. The other things that are feasible in, kind of our complex world is like peer-to-peer evaluation. I like peer-to-peer evaluation because I think even if the peer isn't an expert, the act of giving evaluation is a good learning experience, along with the feedback for the person who is getting. Now, to do that, you have to have some rubrics or some checklists or something that you can use to support somebody who's not an expert still giving feedback. But I think that that's a nice thing, and that can be done over, Zoom or in virtual sessions or something like that. So those are just a few little things.
I would just add, because we have at least 2 other sessions happening on the sector about mentoring, and I think mentoring has such a boom in online remote environments because it's easy and you can really access and ask a lot of people, because it's easier for them to be your mentor when it's online, when it's remote, and it's very, very valuable. And I think it's like missed opportunities in a lot of teams and organizations not to try to build some kind of mentoring or peer supports and peer learning groups.
Absolutely.
So that's my kind of personal call to action for teams to reach out and ask people for mentorship or peer learning opportunities. it's easy, and like remotely we can do that without much of a trouble. Maybe last very simple question. You've mentioned one of newsletter authors I like a lot, which is Filipa Hardman, and I've recommended a lot your book, which is also available in Polish. We have 2 editions of Learning How People Learn, which is called Projektowanie Metod Dydaktycznych in Polish. So I would ask you for any recommendations, books, newsletters, even your own, you would recommend to our audience that they can maybe learn on a constant basis something new in the scope of the topic we were discussing today.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to finish a new book right now that's going to be about bringing more principles from behavioral science into learning and development. So assuming I can get that done in the next few weeks, it should be out in the fall. Other things I recommend, Kathy Moore's book, Map It, which looks at action mapping as a way to focus your efforts. I think that's very good. I just saw this morning that, yeah, there we go.
I even have this.
Perfect. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. I just saw this morning that Megan Torrance has a new book coming out from ATD on data-driven projects. And she is one of my favorite people for really getting into how do you apply this? How do you do it? You know, because I know we've all heard about data-driven things, and sometimes it feels overwhelming, or sometimes it doesn't feel germane to what we're doing in learning and development. So I'm excited about that. I can get the reference for that for you. It's going to come out, I think, in like the next 2 weeks. Oh gosh, my other favorite person that I personally feel like I learned the most from about instructional design is someone who's not terribly active anymore, Kathy Sierra. But she has a fantastic book called Badass: Creating Passionate Users, or creating. I think that's what it's called. I could be getting the subtitle a little wrong, but that's a marvelous and totally worthwhile book to read, especially about how do we talk to people about these skills, because we tend to focus on this method is great when we really should focus on here's how you can do great things with this method. And I think that that's an important frame to look at this with, is how are we supporting people doing the things rather than how are we teaching them the steps. So
thank you.
Yeah, those are some recommendations.
We will put the links on the chat. And Julie, it was my pleasure. So thank you for the discussion. Thank you for the presentation. We highly recommend your book, available in Polish. Hopefully somewhere in our virtual space, it's somewhere here. Easy to maybe get or win in a competition or something like that. If not, get the English or Polish version and follow Julie online. Thank you. That was a great option and opportunity to talk to you, Julie. Goodbye. I think it was amazing, and we will hopefully see maybe in next few years on Sector 3.0 in a different occasion.
Yeah, thank you. And if people have follow-up questions, I have a Facebook group called Design for How People Learn, and I'm always happy to answer questions there. So thank you so much for having me, though.
Amazing. Thank you.